Hello there. Welcome to the Africa Rights Talk podcast, a Center for Human Rights podcast series exploring a range of human rights issues through conversations with academics, practitioners, and activists. I am your host, Victoria Amechi. Let's dive in. Welcome to episode 10 of the Africa Rights Talk podcast. I am here with Professor and also the Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Center at St. Elizabeth University. Could you please introduce yourself and the kind of work that you do?
Certainly. First of all, Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor to be here and really my pleasure. So thank you for shedding light on all the topics that you do and all the critical work that you're doing. My story is pretty simple. My name is Richard Quinlan. I am the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, as well as the chair of the History Department at St. Elizabeth University in Morristown, New Jersey. I spent 26 years as a middle school teacher. And a number of years ago, I attended an educational program on Holocaust education, spending 2 weeks in Germany and Poland. I came home from that, and I realized finally what I wanted to do when I grew up, and pursued a PhD in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College in Pennsylvania, and was fortunate enough to land here at St. Elizabeth. It was my second year, so starting my third year here, and it's been a tremendous experience.
Very good. Thank you for that, Rich. You have this interest that span over 20 years and, discussing and highlighting on very often overlooked issues, especially on the continent of Africa. And based on this interest, you took into visibilizing silent genocides, and you've written on the silent genocide that happened in Ethiopia's Tigray region, the Tigray conflict. And also, I think you, in a recent article, you published on the situation in Somaliland, the same issue. And you think the same attention should be given to Burundi because it's often an overlooked country. Can you kind of give the importance of shedding light on Burundi when it comes to conflicts and genocide?
Certainly. The story of Burundi really fascinated me because when I was thinking about a dissertation, I really wanted to address a genocide that has been tragically overlooked. When you think about Burundi, it's such a gorgeous country with such wonderful people, yet there's a real darkness to its history that has not fully been addressed. And I remember comments made in 1988 by René Lamarchand, one of the great scholars on Burundi. And he was speaking to the House of Representatives in the US. And he said, not enough people care. People just aren't interested in pursuing knowledge on these situations. And he was obviously speaking about the 72 genocide, tragically 5 years before the 1993 genocide. And as a really quick story, as an aside, about 1972, Richard Nixon actually wanted to speak out and condemn what was happening in Burundi in 72. And he received a memo back from Henry Kissinger. And the memo said, I'm going to paraphrase it, but the memo said, our relationship with Burundi is minuscule. All we do is import some coffee. So there was a perspective that Burundi, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but just wasn't important enough for the United States to speak out and condemn what was happening. And when you have situations like that, when you have leaders of countries believing that another nation, for whatever reason, isn't worthy of public discussion, well, then how in the world do these atrocities ever stop? Because you need public discourse coming obviously from the leaders and the people of the nation that's affected, but you need significant powers around the world to step forward and say that we can't allow this and we're going to do something to stop it.
I agree 100% too. I feel Burundi is an important country, especially in the historical context. It's in an important country to look at. So I do agree with you on that. Thank you for that. Yeah, it was last week we talked about, you highlighted Rwanda and Burundi pretty much face the same thing, the same persecution, the same genocidal metrics of persecution, and but the way they've approached reconciliation probably has been different. The way they've approached justice has been different, and also maybe rehabilitation. Why do you think their approaches to this justice and reconciliation and rehabilitation has been different?
Well, it's really fascinating to me because you think about what transpired in Burundi in 1993, and it just received such little attention. Rwanda occurs in 94, and the world knows about it. It became a global discussion, and Rwanda ended up becoming what's sometimes nicknamed sort of a donor darling. The world paid attention, celebrities talked about it, and I think whenever a light is then placed on a genocide or the mass atrocity, it puts pressure on the government, on the country to do something. And what Rwanda did, and I've had the pleasure or the honor of speaking with several survivors of the Rwandan genocide, and I've asked them the same question. And one of the things that they say to me is that they've had political stability. We can criticize the Rwandan government any way we like, and obviously not everyone's going to agree with every policy, but there's been a stability in Rwanda that has allowed it to invest in infrastructure, invest in Wi-Fi and technology. You have a country that is very modern. Now they've gone, and again, there are some imperfections there. The Gacaca courts, for example, women were not allowed to publicly discuss sexual assault that they endured. Well, if you're going to go after those who perpetrated genocide, as painful as any topic can be, it has to be discussed in full. We can't simply pick and choose and say, well, something's off limits. Nothing should be off limits when you're prosecuting people who perpetrated genocide. But Rwanda has been much more open and more public with the recognition of what happened. Burundi, tragically, you had government officials for a very long time denying that 1972 even happened. Forget the mass graves that were found and the firsthand accounts that existed. You had political officials saying it's a fallacy, everything's overrated, or it never happened at all. Well, that's an incredibly significant mountain to climb if you're going to then look for transitional justice. And I remember just a couple of years ago, the current government of Burundi opened up some public discussions on 72. They wanted to be more transparent. Those public discussions lasted a matter of weeks, and then they were shut down. So here you are again in the same situation, the same position of the government saying, and of course, this influences the media, this influences the press. People aren't allowed to talk about it. And if you don't recognize the darkness and the unpleasantry of your own history, progress is impossible. And I'm sitting here in New Jersey in the United States. The U.S. is actually listed as a genocide denying nation because of what transpired with Native Americans. We still haven't really come to grips with what was done to Native Americans in this country. There have been some strides, but we have a long way to go. And Burundi, on a certain level, mirrors that.
Thank you for that. I really do also mirror the same sentiments. I feel like the United States, even currently as what's happening in the Israel-Gaza war, well, why must we play this politics when it comes to issues like this? And it's very implicative in the way history is being told. Because if we go on the streets of the world, people are going to have, two or very different opinions as to what is clearly a genocidal war. What is the purpose behind denying this stuff? We have to get into the bottom of that. Why? What are the benefits? Is there any political? What is the benefit of seeing human suffering, basically? So I do agree with you. I think, and I also feel like in our last discussion before this podcast, I think Rwanda mirrors the same thing as the US. That's why of late now, of this presence become a very important country in Africa. We have to dig into why that is, why they denying, why they mirroring the way America denies wars and genocides that in the future kind of benefits them. So we're gonna have to get into that. But I do agree with you, Rich, on that note.
You raised a tremendous point there that we're talking about people, not politics, not policy. You're looking at the mass slaughter of human beings, and that loss of life should not be placed in political boxes or used as some sort of political argument. And I think this is one of the greatest factors in combating genocide, is that it is turned into a political argument where what it needs to be is just a global understanding and desire for empathy, and understand that people are suffering tremendously and what can be done to stop it. And that's actually not asked enough, I don't feel.
I'm not sure about if you're familiar with the international criminal justice system, the ICJ, and the many failed attempts to bring very popular political or criminal masterminds to justice. And, I think most of those courts complain about the, cross-border, implications or, consequences. And, the residual mechanism for criminal tribunals have, tried, even with the case of Putin, with the case of al-Bashir, it's like, it's not going to be possible. We are talking about accountability and bringing people, getting people justice and bringing people to face the consequences of their crimes. How do you think when we foster a culture of accountability for international crimes like this genocides in Rwanda, Burundi, Israel, Gaza, how do you think that can lead to supporting the process of investigation and bringing, these criminals to justice?
It's a great question, a great point. And we've seen this issue going all the way back to Nuremberg after World War II, when you're talking about the people that you can actually place on trial. And overwhelmingly, one of the similarities that we see among leaders that perpetrate genocide is they're extraordinarily insulated. Whether it's the military or whether it's just an inner circle of people who protect them. So it's extraordinarily difficult to bring to justice really the sort of the top of any government that is carrying out these mass atrocities. So if you can't get those at the very top for whatever reason, whether it's Hitler committing suicide or Putin just seemingly untouchable, you have to try to arrest, to prosecute, to put extraordinary international pressure on those who are decision makers, but maybe not the very top of a country's government. And what this is going to require is, once again, a global voice. You look at the ICJ, the ICC, there are, and I'm not in any way downplaying the importance of these organizations, but they've had more failures than successes. And it's extraordinarily frustrating, but I think the reason why is because these institutions are allowed to sort of operate as just these little independent bodies, and the rest of the world doesn't really pay much attention. And so I think if there was greater global collaboration and support for these groups to say the work that you're doing is vital. These are criminals of the highest level. They cannot be allowed to get away with these crimes, because it sends a message to others who would follow in their footsteps. If I'm not going to be arrested, if I'm not going to be prosecuted, if I'm not going to be jailed or certainly not executed for ordering mass murder, well, what are they afraid of? It's only going to allow the cycle to continue. And I making a historical reference, there's a famous quote from Hitler where he openly mocked the League of Nations. The League of Nations existed, and there were obviously dozens of countries that bought into it and were members and really were hoping for the best, but it ended up being too weak to stop anything. And certainly had failed in stopping the onset of World War II, and of course then the Holocaust. So we need greater global cooperation. That I think is the key to all of this.
Thank you for that. I do agree. The thing is, on the concerted global effort to bring people to justice, especially individual, because I think always community and group effort supersede an individual interest, individual crimes. It should not matter how political or powerful that person is. it's just and human to seek as the world to seek justice against that individual. So I never really like accept political conversations regarding justice because it's not really the issue there. It's not really the answer to that kind of question. My next question would be we've discussed the group effort. How do you think Burundi itself as a nation? What capacity does Burundi itself, government-wise, political-wise, economically-wise, can address the impunity upon its people when it comes to genocide-related crimes? And how can all of the institutions, legal institutional measures to bring justice to crimes committed against its people?
So Burundi is there's a dichotomy with what's happening right now in Burundi because Vision 2025, that is talking about the expansion of electricity. I mean, barely 10% of the population in Burundi have access to electricity. And that obviously, it goes without saying that is certainly a massive impediment to any kind of progress. And because you're not connected to the world. I mean, how can Burundi really be part of the global if 90% of their people do not have access to the internet, do not have access to just basic electricity?
Sure.
It's to be a focus on the population and hoping that Vision 2025 really does become what the government has declared it can be. But 2025 isn't all that far off. And so they're really thinking about it almost be kind of miraculous to fully achieve all that they're talking about with Vision 2025. But the other concerns for me involving Burundi are personal liberties. There's certainly repression and limitations on freedom of the press. You have President and Ende Ashimi calling for the stoning of homosexuals. Burundi has to realize that if they're going to be part of the global community and engage in trade, which, by the way, Burundi's rich in natural resources. It goes far beyond coffee, as great as their coffee is. So there are opportunities for Burundi to expand its role around the world. Now, there have been, for example, trade agreements among those East Asian nations, the Great Lakes region, which is great. It's phenomenal if those nations, Tanzania and Rwanda, Burundi, are going to support each other. That's wonderful, and it's a great place to start. But Burundi has to realize that it needs to be part of the larger world. As I mentioned in our conversation, this is purely my, and I'm sure others far more skilled than I have the same view, but I feel the 21st century belongs to Africa. There's just such room for growth and development, and there's so many natural resources. Africa stands on the precipice, collectively, I believe, of real greatness. And as someone who has grown to care deeply about Burundi, having through the research, the people that I've met and spoken with, I don't want to see her left behind. And I think tragically right now, Burundi's on a path where that can happen. And I think the government has to take into account whatever your religious perspective may be, that progress means acceptance, not tolerance. Tolerance is just you're putting up with whatever's around you. There has to be an acceptance of differences, an acceptance of different opinions, and an openness for real communication. If not, you remain permanently where you are right now, and the countries around you are going to continue to grow. They're going to continue to evolve. They're going to continue to become a greater global presence. And then where will you be? Burundi's often listed, depending on where you look, as the poorest country in the world. There's no reason to be. There's no reason to be. There needs to be investment. But whether you are the IMF, the World Bank, other countries around the world, including the United States, that has opened up a little bit more dialogue with Burundi, you're not going to get loans. You're not going to get trade agreements if you're talking about stoning people, if you're not taking significant steps forward to elevate the quality of life for your population. These are real concerns.
Thank you for that. I really do agree on the future as being African, but it's just like there's so many obstacles. There's so many obstacles, from impunity to the hate to, just like you mentioned, like 90% of the population of Burundi has no access to basic amenities, basic structures, infrastructure. And I think it's that narrative. Like, maybe I'm also part of the problem. Maybe pushing that narrative that, oh, we're just too problematic as a continent to fix our issues. You looking from the outside, to able to see potential, it's very amazing. And thank you for that. And I hope that at some point, like you said, we fighting for a future, moving towards a better Africa. Burundi is part of, the giants someday.
Again, looking at history, I think there also has to be greater recognition from the colonial powers. And I personally believe that they do have a bit of an obligation to help out nations where they created the problems. We've seen Belgium become a little bit more open about the Congo and the lasting impact of King Leopold. Well, let's not forget that in Rwanda, Burundi, when they were just one nation and the Belgians had the occupation, particularly in Burundi, they placed the Tutsi in power, the minority group, about 15%. And why did they do it? Because the Belgians looked at them and thought, well, they have a different facial structure, different body structure. They look, quote, more European. And they then set, in a very real way, this blueprint for violence and interethnic hatred. And so I would also want to see, former colonial powers such as Belgium say, a lot of this is on us, and we want to step forward and aid Burundi. Because the reality of history, and this is, you and I are not here overwhelmingly expressing opinions. We're talking about facts, and facts have to drive the argument. Facts have to drive the recovery. And there has to also be a recognition by those European nations that, going back to the Congress of, the Congress of Berlin, that divided up the entire continent, they have to take greater responsibility for what they did historically and help their former colonies move forward. Because, let's think about what happened when it came to independence, right? Countries in Africa were granted independence and then essentially said or told, you figure it out. And they were left without a blueprint. They were left without infrastructure. They were left without sort of guidelines to how to conduct free and fair elections. And so some of those cyclical issues that we see in Africa, the emergence of tyrants and dictators and countries that have become largely under the control of autocratic leaders, well, that's partially, if not overwhelmingly, an outgrowth of the colonial failures.
I agree with you so much on that, because I happen to be a master's student, and I took a class in legal philosophy and history. And it was discussed that a very important part of reconciliation and moving forward, like people say, is addressing what has happened and not trying to run away from based on embarrassment. I think most of these neo-colonial powers have attributed the need to move forward based on feeling of embarrassment, because your autocratic government back in the day is what these people are actually mirroring to rule their people after you left. And it seems like it's not working. It's widespread, human atrocities, basically. So I feel a very important part of justice or reconciliation is what has historically happened and addressing the historical issue that seem to have brought about this current lack of progress, lack of development, basically. So I do agree. We need to look at the historical connect between our the colonial powers, and the abuses, no socioeconomic developments in those nations that they once led or once, ruled over. So I do agree with that. And that would lead me to my next question. Based on this, discussion that we've just had regarding history and, the influence of colonial powers on the continent, what do you think African nations can come together?
Well, it's a complex question. And I know people would love to give a simple answer and just say, well, can't you realize you're all part of the same continent? You all should have the same goals. But Pan-Africanism, as we've seen in other parts of the world, Pan-Arabism, for example, is an extraordinarily complicated thing to achieve because each nation, each people's their own identity, their own customs, traditions, beliefs. And so you've got to find that balance between celebrating the uniqueness of the different regions and countries of Africa, while also recognizing that collectively there's far more power. And I think where we are right now in Africa is it's a delicate balancing act because you don't want to seem dependent upon the West, and it's because it's kind of a vicious cycle. Because if Western nations give loans, or we certainly have seen this with China, if these countries come in and they try to assert some sort of role in the rebuilding or the evolution of a nation, well, now that country is tied to and almost dependent upon this other nation. It's almost neo-colonialism. It's just, it's colonialism under another name. And so I think what we have seen in some areas, again, there are sort of regional trade agreements, for example, but I think there has to be more of a message from some of the leading powers in Africa that as a continent, there is a greater amount of natural resources than anywhere in the world. And you cannot allow yourself to be, for lack of a better word, exploited by larger, wealthier countries. Invest in yourself, not just infrastructure, not just electricity, but the ability to actually harvest your own natural resources for yourself and become a nation like the Congo is sitting on trillions of dollars of natural resources. Imagine what they could do if they can harvest that, if they can research that, if they can reach those. I'm sorry. So I think if Africa more collectively said, we're going to pool our money, we're going to help a country like Congo, we're going to help them access natural resources that we can begin to then trade globally. And since we're going to work together, we can all help each other. But it's going to be very difficult because whenever you have countries that say we're going to work together, no country wants to be told what to do by somebody else. I mean, I'm sitting here in the United States and the US is very comfortable telling other nations around the world what to do. We don't want to be told what to do. And so, that's the struggle. But I think I happen to have tremendous optimism in Africa as a continent, as Burundi, as a nation. And one of the reasons why specifically Burundi is the average age, like the median age is 17. They want change. Africa is a youthful continent. Who has always traditionally driven change anywhere in the world? It's the young, and they want jobs, and they want education, and they want a future. It's no different than young people anywhere else in the world. I think leaders have to understand that they cannot just sit in their isolated little palaces somewhere and ignore what's happening, because if you ignore it, then you start to see revolution, then you start to see violence. You don't want that. You obviously want to find peaceful resolutions. So listen to your youth. I talked to young people in Burundi. One young man had a great story. He said, the greeting in Burundi used to be, are you Hutu or are you Tutsi? And he now said, we don't ask that anymore. We don't care. He said, that's what our parents did. That's what our grandparents did. We don't want to live like that. And so I have confidence, but I'm also realistic and hopeful that the youth within these nations can begin to drive change, because I think that is really the future of Africa.
I agree. Thank you. I believe strongly in the change of a youthful country. And I think that is also the the issue with these old leaders, because they understand what you were saying, the progress, the changes that the youth, if they put their mind to it, can make in a particular country. It can actually work. We just have to see it and truly trust and invest in, like you said, invest in our people and invest in our young people, and we can actually get that to where we dream of. And I really do appreciate conversations like this, bringing people back to the drawing board. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I mean, if leaders who are older and very well established and have their beliefs and the comfort of their lives, if they listen to the youth and make changes, that doesn't mean they're being driven out of power. If anything, it would only strengthen their position of leadership in the country. Their power, their positions become threatened when you have a general population that is growing increasingly angry. No revolution ever happened because people liked the person in power. Revolutions happen because people are angry and they're frustrated and they want change and they feel ignored. And that's what I don't know how we get that message across. I mean, you're absolutely right. Conversations like this are vital, but it has to be expressed to those who have the capacity to make change. That you sit in a position where you can strengthen your entire nation, and then that spreads across the continent.
Thank you for that. I read about you. You believe in the advocacy of the less fortunate, the disenfranchised, and you believe so much in research to bring light onto things that are often overlooked. And it's brought us to this discussion of very important country like Burundi, who has often been overlooked in history, even in current political. What do you think is the importance of research institutes like your university, the Center for Human Rights, my institution, advocacy organizations, contribute to making unimportant issues relevant and important for discussions like the case of Burundi? How do you think we can research organizations bring awareness to human rights abuses in Africa?
So it has to be taught and it has to be publicized. I went through a 5-year PhD program and I loved every single second of it. Burundi was referenced once, and it was only referenced in a course that I was taking about the Rwandan genocide. So first of all, there's that old idea that Rwanda and Burundi are sort of twins. They're not. They're distinct nations and should be treated as such. And so you have to go beyond the idea of, well, we reference Burundi because they're right next door to Rwanda, but then you focus only on the Rwandan genocide. There has to be a concerted effort by researchers, people who are motivated for change like yourself. What you're doing is so incredibly important because you're publicizing these issues. Because if they're never discussed, whether it's in a classroom, a podcast, through an NGO, whatever it might be, if they're never discussed, then change is impossible. And it falls into that black hole of history, and people don't have any appreciation for how serious these events were and the lasting ramifications and the trauma that was sort of delivered to the people who live there. And so I was motivated to study Burundi because even going into my research, I knew so little about the country. And I ended up in a very real way just sort of falling in love with it because the people are wonderful, the country's gorgeous, and I think there's so much room for growth, but nothing's going to happen if people don't know the truth. And it might sound like a cliche because being in the classroom is the only job I've ever had, but everything revolves around education. It has to start there, because if it's never taught, then how is there ever going to be progress?
I do agree on the importance of it. I think most of the reasons why we have this problem is because of ignorance and no knowledge about what's going on whatsoever in a very true and authentic manner. No matter how little they are, individual history of the nation, of each nation, should not be conflated into one to make, Africans suffer like this. Rwandan, Burundians, the same people. No, they're not. So I really believe in education as a very important tool. And I don't know if you have any concluding remarks, on the legacy of Burundi?
So first of all, in terms of closing remarks, thank you again for hosting me. This has been fantastic, and I'm so appreciative of both this opportunity and everything that you do. It's remarkable, and wishing you nothing but continued success and influence. So thank you. In terms of Burundi, I don't want to sound as if I'm placing some of a pretty bow on a situation that does have elements of desperation to it. That's the reality. But again, I turn to my hope for the future because of young Burundians. And I think they view the world through a very different lens, because even though there's such a limit to electricity, those who have it, whether you're living in Bujumbura or other larger cities, they know what's happening in other parts of the world. It's not so closed off that young Burundians don't know that life is pretty good in other places. And so they're going to ask that question, why isn't it here? Why don't we have what other nations do? And they'll be motivated for change. They'll be motivated to put pressure on leaders. They'll be motivated to protest, and not violently, but just in a way that's going to raise attention. And I think that's where change happens. And I do believe, because of Burundi's population, its location in Africa, its natural resources, I see an opportunity for great progress. We'll see what Vision 2025 brings, and I'm really hoping that it becomes the first significant step towards the continued development of Burundi, so maybe she can match what her next door neighbor in Rwanda has done and reassert herself as a great, significant nation within Africa.
I do hope so. And thank you so much, Rich, for giving us your time to discuss this issue. And I also wish you well in your institution, in your research. I hope the future that you hope for Africa comes to life, something in our lifetimes. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of the morning, and I hope sometime again we get together to discuss a very important issue regarding human rights. Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jen. Bye.
Anytime you want. Here.
All right, sure. All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy your summer break. Bye.
Yeah.
You have just listened to the Africa Rights Talk podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channels, social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.